Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you. It is the morning here for me in Adelaide, Australia, and a very cold, wintry morning. So, from a place of opposites, uh,
Yeah.
hello. It's great to be here, and I'm really looking forward to talking to you about the ideas of René Girard. I have designed this talk for a general but academic audience. For those of you who are very eager to share the ideas of Girard with your non-academic friends and family, please feel free to contact me about the other resources I have for doing that. And hopefully today will be a great introduction for those of you with an academic mindset who'd like to know a little more about the ideas of René Girard. The cornerstone of Girard's theory is the idea of mimetic desire, outlined in his first book, Deceit, Desire, and the Novel. For Girard, mimesis, from the Greek imitation, is the basis of desire. In contrast to theories of desire that state that our desires originate within us and are a two-part relationship between the subject and the object, Girard says that our desires are not spontaneous but imitative. One way to represent this is with a triangular diagram. We call A the subject. B is what Girard calls A's model or mediator. A admires B, he wants to be like B, he observes B, and he learns what to desire from B. If B desires it, it becomes desirable in A's eyes. A thinks that his desire for the object is a straight line between them, but in fact, he gets to the object via B. Sometimes Girard calls this triangular desire instead of mimetic desire. In Deceit, Desire, and the Novel, Girard argues that great novelists understand that desire is mimetic. Bad novels, he says, repeat the lie of spontaneous desire, that our desires are innate. But truly great novels reveal the truth. He starts with the example of Don Quixote. To quote, I want you to know, Sancho, that the famous Amadis of Gaul was one of the most perfect knight-errants. We others who fight under the banner of love and chivalry should imitate him. Thus, my friend Sancho, I reckon that whoever imitates him best will come closest to perfect chivalry. Girard argues that Cervantes is depicting desire as mimetic. Don Quixote is not choosing what to desire as an individual prerogative, but rather desires objects in imitation of Amadis. The psychology of Quixote is what Girard terms desire according to the other, as opposed to the romantic ideal of desire according to oneself. Girard further explores the nature of mimetic desire in his examination of two further novels, Flaubert's Madame Bovary and Stendhal's The Red and the Black. He denotes Stendhal's vanité as a term for mimetic desire, the vain pursuit of imitation in order to more closely resemble the model seen in a plethora of Stendhalian characters. Flaubert's Emma Bovary, likewise, has had her imagination shaped by stories of romantic heroines and has no apparent sense of self apart from her romantic ideals. The object, according to Girard, is not what is really desired. The object is only a means of reaching the mediator. The desire is aimed at acquiring the mediator's being. The subject senses an ontological emptiness in himself, a lack of identity, a sense of being the only one excluded from the fraternity of humankind. Mimetic desire is a response to a feeling of an essential lack, that being nothing by themselves, they may become something by imitation. The subject expects his being to be radically changed by the act of possession of that object. This aspect of Girard's theory means that object scarcity, real or perceived, is not necessary to stimulate mimetic desire, because to possess the object does not satisfy the ontological lack. To quote Girard, the subject discovers that possession of the object has not changed his being. The moment the hero takes hold of the desired object, its virtue disappears like gas from a burst balloon. He cannot deny the failure, but he can confine its results to the object which he now possesses, and possibly to the mediator who directed him to it. The power to transform him he confers elsewhere, on a second object, a second model, a new desire. The hero goes through his existence from desire to desire as one crosses a stream, jumping from one slippery stone to another. The frustration occasioned by this continual failure certainly bothers the Girardian subject, but generally Girard describes this process as unconscious, or at least unreflective. The subject has no insight into the deceptive nature of mimetic desire, and so expectantly and optimistically places his hope on the next object or mediator as eminently likely to deliver satisfaction. The aspect of mimetic desire that does cause genuine distress to the Girardian subject is the notion Girard describes next, mimetic rivalry. In Stendhal's The Red and the Black, Monsieur de Renal and Valenod are the two richest and most influential men in town, and Monsieur de Renal desires to hire Julien as a tutor because he believes that Valenod desires Julien for himself. In this situation, the subject and the model occupy the same social space, a circumstance essentially different from that of Don Quixote or Madame Bovary. Don Quixote's model Amadis is a fictional character. There can be no contact between them, and Quixote will never perceive Amadis as an impediment to his goal of being a chivalrous knight. Emma Bovary has one tantalizing glimpse of her models in the flesh, the aristocratic young ladies at the ball, but she will never see them again and never travel to Paris to vie with them for romantic attentions. But by contrast, Monsieur de Renal sees Valenod as a rival for prestige and possessions. Valenod teaches Monsieur de Renal what to desire, but also appears as a potential hurdle in acquiring the object of desire. The mediator can no longer act his role of model without also acting or appearing to act the role of obstacle. When Valenod sees the desire of Monsieur de Renal, this stimulates his own desire in turn. In other words, the mimetic nature of desire means that when the mediator sees the subject desiring the object, the mediator will desire the object even more. The positions of subject and model become irrelevant. The triangle is turned sideways. They are infinitely reciprocally orienting the desirers towards the object via each other. They're equally copying each other, provoking more and more imitative desire, and also increasingly seeing the other as a hated rival who seeks to keep the desired object for himself and prevent others from acquiring it. The distance between subject and model, Girard describes as the height of the triangle. When this distance is sufficient to prevent contact between the mediator and the subject, Girard calls this external mediation. The model is far away from the subject's world, there can be no rivalry. Internal mediation occurs when A and B's respective spheres touch, so that they can perceive one another as rivals. And this distance does not have to just be geographic or temporal. The distance for Madame Bovary between Yonville and Paris is considerable, but social distance can also separate the subject and the model. Don Quixote is physically distant from Amadis, but Sancho Panza takes his master as his model and not his rival. He desires a version of chivalric life appropriate to his station rather than exact replica of the prestigious status of his master. As Girard says, Don Quixote and Sancho are close to each other physically, but the social distance which separates them remains insuperable, and the harmony between the two companions is never seriously troubled. External mediation, according to Girard, admits some conscious awareness of admiration of the model. Don Quixote is passionately lyrical on the subject of Amadis, his hero. By contrast, the subject of internal mediation does not boast of his efforts to imitate, but hides them even from himself. The subject resents the mediator for being what the subject herself seeks to become. And this resentment is provoked by the paradox that the more hostile and haughty the mediator, the greater her prestige in the eyes of the subject. Girard goes into detail about the way that envy goes beyond covetousness and into hatred. Quote, the envious person's imagination transforms into real concerted opposition the passive obstacle which the possessor puts in his way. These phenomena of envy and resentment are most evident in cases of close internal mediation, such as the petty social rivalry of Monsieur de Renal and Valenod. Girard follows Stendhal and Max Scheler to suggest that the 19th century was pervaded by this romantic state of mind because of its ongoing social upheavals, an increase in social mobility, decline of old systems of rigidly stratified social structure. In a modern democratic society, mimetic desire is the passionate imitation of individuals who are fundamentally our equals. Girard argues that ancient societies were constructed in order to minimize rivalry by formalizing each individual's place in a highly stratified and immovable social structure. By contrast, modern societies have tended to remove social boundaries. However, admiration, imitation, and envy are not reduced by this reduction in formal status. Girard argues that the upper class gain their prestige through the aspirations of the bourgeoisie to join them, and the desire of the middle class for wealth and privilege stimulates the desire of the upper class to hold on to those things. The modern individual is surrounded by potential models and potential imitators. As Girard describes, that modern men will copy each other, and idolatry of one person is replaced by hatred of 100,000 rivals. The push and shove of mimetic rivalry escalates to what Girard calls mimetic crisis, a point at which communal bonds are precarious or forgotten, and social stability has broken down. The mimetic nature of desire will eventually cause violence. Or rather, violence is the process itself when people try to prevent each other from getting the object they all desire, which can be a material possession, but includes metaphysical objects like success. Happy, healthy communities need their members to feel allied with one another. Neighbors are there to help each other. We're on the same team, we're better together. But A and B now see each other as rivals. The bonds and niceties that hold society together will strain under the pressure. Rivalry leads to resentment and eventually to violence. Violence is met with retaliation, more violence. The mimetic feedback process creates a violent loop as the subject and model are affected by one another's desire, and they seek to remove the other as obstacle more and more forcefully. The mimetic antagonists are caught in an escalation of frustration. This has consequences not only for ally relationships and social bonds, the building blocks of a functional community, but for the basic structures of meaning itself. According to Girard, because the violent conflict is mimetic and reciprocal, the antagonists increasingly resemble one another. And this loss of difference is seen as a serious threat to meaning, since meanings and definitions are generally understood in terms of oppositional notions, contrasts, and sequence. Therefore, not only social order and peace, but the deeply productive structures of meaning depend upon differentiated distinctions. It should be noted here that Girard is not endorsing formal structures of difference, especially social hierarchies, as an ideal state for humankind, but rather he's describing things as he believes they have been for for many human societies and seeking to understand the nature of the crisis that those societies sought to avoid. Girard calls this mimetic crisis, the state in which difference, and therefore all meaning, is lost or unstable and chaos results. Thus, mimetic crisis is a state of violent conflict between human individuals, but also a state in which meaning itself seems precariously unstable. To quote Girard again, in this situation, no one and nothing is spared. Coherent thinking collapses and rational activities are abandoned. All associative forms are dissolved or become antagonistic. All values, spiritual or material, perish. In the undifferentiated state of mimetic crisis, the Girardian subjects are in dire need of some means of restoring order and resolving conflict. This means is the next point in the Girardian narrative and the crux of his theory. At the climax of a mimetic crisis, the affected community can't stop the inevitable violence. Their only option is to alter its trajectory from the endless push and shove and escalation of mimetic rivalry to a collective act against an outside party who won't or can't retaliate, thus breaking the cycle. The victim is actually blamed for the crisis and expelled from the community. This process Girard sees beginning in primitive human societies and terms it the scapegoat mechanism. He introduced this notion in Violence and the Sacred and expanded upon it in his next major work, The Scapegoat. The scapegoat mechanism works because it is the only violence that ends violence. All the previous violence directed by members of the community against one another begat further violence in the form of retaliation. Simply calling a halt to this retaliatory violence is impossible, as each aggrieved victim returns blow for blow, and if the conflict leads to death, the fight is taken up by his or her surviving relatives or allies. So violence cannot be arbitrarily halted, but it can be diverted to another object. The scapegoat is a different kind of victim, one who is marginal in the community and has no allies to seek vengeance for his or her death. Violence directed towards the scapegoat is therefore at last efficacious, deflecting upon an expendable victim the violence that would otherwise continue to rebound throughout the community. The person who becomes the eventual scapegoat is both vulnerable and close at hand. In other words, part of the community whilst also not a part, not integrated, marginal. Girard cites examples such as prisoners of war, slaves, small children prior to rites of initiation or naming, having no formal place in society, unmarried adolescents, the handicapped, and foreigners as belonging to this category. The essential characteristic of an eligible scapegoat is the fact that between such victims and their community, a crucial social link is missing, which means that they can be the targets of violence without provoking reprisals. Instead, the communal force of uncontrolled hostility can be safely and unanimously directed against a single individual whose death or expulsion stops the escalation of violence and delivers peace. Girard claims that in these early acts of spontaneous violence, the scapegoat was not consciously chosen to serve this purpose. Rather, the scapegoating happens spontaneously and due to mimetic forces, as one, then some, then all antagonists turn upon the scapegoat in a snowball effect. To quote, "The slightest hint, the most groundless accusation can circulate with vertiginous speed and is transformed into irrefutable proof. The corporate sense of conviction snowballs, each member taking confidence from his neighbor by a rapid process of mimesis. The scapegoat's expulsion as an outsider redefines and recoheres the insiders of the community. In the act of scapegoating, rivals are transformed into allies, turning their violence upon the victim. This unanimous act of violence creates what scholar Chris Fleming has described as an intense human solidarity, which draws together all the former antagonists into a unified group. As Girard summarizes, whereas mimetic rivalry is inevitably divisive, causing the contestants to fight over an object they cannot all appropriate together, mimetic antagonism is ultimately unitive, or rather reunitive, since they can all rush against that victim. In this process, the scapegoat is characterized as the cause of the crisis, the truly deserving object of violence, against whom violence finally worked. Since violence subsides after the act of scapegoating, it is said to have been incarnate in the victim and to have departed the community along with him, leaving the remaining reunited mob free of infection. In fact, the scapegoat is not the cause of the crisis, but rather the only accused person to whom a charge of guilt will stick. The accusations that begin stick because of the scapegoat's isolated vulnerability. Since no one defends him or protests at the fairness of his persecution, it is easy to categorize him as guilty. Chris Fleming notes that the more the community can believe in the guilt of the scapegoat, the more effective the unifying power of the scapegoat mechanism. Girard describes catharsis as the relief and reunification experienced by a community through the scapegoat mechanism. And in Violence and the Sacred, he examines many anthropological examples of collective violence and reads these as the scapegoat mechanism becoming ritualized and carried out as a formal rite in order to deliver this cathartic benefit regularly to the community. In this mode, the scapegoat mechanism serves as prevention rather than cure, purging the community of the tensions that are amassed by mimetic rivalry. So ritual human sacrifice arises out of the scapegoat mechanism. It is catharsis performed in a structural setting that strongly resembles spontaneous victimization. And these rituals are the basis of early religions. The scapegoat mechanism becomes a ritual of religious purification that aims to cleanse the community of impurities and restore peace and order. The scapegoat may initially be seen as a poisonous intruder, but her death also saves and restores the community from its own violence. Since the community associates the escape from chaos and return to order with the death of the scapegoat, she acquires an aura not only of malevolence beyond her deserts, but also an association with beneficence and blessing. The scapegoat thus acquires a numinosity that Girard argues begins the category of the sacred, in which the scapegoat assumes the place of a god. I quote, "The experience of a supremely evil and then beneficent being whose appearance and disappearance are punctuated by collective murder cannot fail to be literally gripping. The community that was once so terribly stricken suddenly finds itself free of antagonism, completely delivered." The members of the community, according to Girard, have no insight into the true nature of the rivalrous crisis, its cause in their own competitiveness and hatred, which is dissolved in the action against the scapegoat. They think of the scapegoat as having the power to be supernaturally poisonous, causing the crisis, and also supernaturally beneficent, curing the crisis. This may seem incredible, Girard concedes, but he defends this double transference as the only possible result of scapegoat violence. The persecutors cannot take credit for the resolution of the crisis and their reconciliation with one another, because they see themselves as purely passive. The only possible explanation is the power of the scapegoat. While scapegoat expulsions cannot cure epidemics or halt floods, Girard argues that the main dimension of every crisis is the way in which it affects human society. The crisis in a physical environment threatens the stability of the social environment. While the flood lasts, scapegoats may be sacrificed in vain, but the eventual sacrifice that coincides with the receding waters will also coincide with an end to the personal repercussions of the flood, the social impacts, and the victim's death will be believed to have affected all these phenomena. The scapegoat figure, once ritualized, is at once then the most despicable delinquent and the means of salvation for the community. Girard examines in detail a number of religious rituals that seem to follow this pattern, such as the crowning of a king in a Central African tribe, whose royalty belonged to the category which anthropological observers have dubbed sacred monarchies, in which the king is invested with honor, but after a certain period is ritually killed. As part of the institution of ritual, religion, and the category of the sacred, Girard cites the various taboos and prohibitions that surround early human culture. And he posits that these prohibitions are preventative measures against mimetic crisis. Incest taboos control the relationship between siblings, establish difference, and prevent rivalry within families. Rules governing the use of objects, acquisition, and exchange of property likewise constrain mimetic envy. Strictures that forbid mirrors or imitated images, or that prescribe the killing of twins at birth, may signify fear of doubles and undifferentiation. Together with taboos, there are increasingly stylized religious festivals to maintain the sacred institution, and Girard notes the plethora of early festivals that we know of, which are based on violation of taboos and contravention of social structures. Such festivals demonstrate the necessity of prohibitions even as they formally depart from them. In such festivals, sexual promiscuity, even incest, may be prescribed. Family and class structures are dissolved. Children may disrespect their parents. Slaves beat their masters. Citizens hurl insults at one another. The visual spectacle may include parades of transvestite figures, clashing colours, mock contests that display hyperbolized rivalry. And for Girard, these festivals are a form of ritual which reenact mimetic crisis and cathartic resolution, with a crowning sacrificial act, often real, sometimes symbolic, performing the chaos of the crisis and the jubilation at its end. This is one of the most difficult parts of Girardian theory to really get our heads around. And with apologies to those who have done amazing work in explaining this in very detailed and deep and nuanced ways, I would like to share with you a brief summary from one of my works of how this process of the scapegoat becoming a god works. Nathan, are you able to unmute yourself? Would you like to play a part with me and do a voice here? No, I don't hear Nathan. Okay.
I'm sorry. I suppose I can.
Would you like to play the character on the left, the one who begins speaking?
Sure.
Okay, off we go.
Okay. Things have been great ever since we killed that weird old blind woman.
Yeah, she really polluted everything. The drought, the fighting, they all went away since we killed her. Even that terrible rash I had after she died, it cleared right up.
She must have been very powerful, actually, to poison everything.
And powerful enough to fix everything, too, and make it rain and stuff.
Wow, do you reckon she was like a goddess?
Yeah, she must have been. Ordinary old women don't have superpowers, dude.
We should build a shrine to her. She saved us.
She nearly killed us first, though, and she gave me a rash.
Gods are like that. Help me lift these big rocks.
Thank you, Nathan.
You're welcome.
A society in the midst of mimetic crisis is, according to Girard's narrative, in need of a scapegoat. The essential qualities of a scapegoat are marginality, ensuring the absence of reprisals and an end to the cycle of violence. But Girard observes several secondary qualities that serve to make a scapegoat a particularly effective medium of catharsis for the community. He is here observing and collating the features of a range of phenomena that he classes as scapegoat mechanisms: ancient ritual sacrifice, their modern forms in witch hunts, such as the persecution of Jews during the Black Plague, and also narrative forms, which I'll get to later. These extra eligible scapegoats are individuals who bear what Girard calls marks or stereotypes of persecution, characteristics that make them very liable to be associated with the crisis and to take the blame for it, because they bear features that in some way resemble the nature of the crisis itself. As I've described, mimetic crisis is a state without differentiation, a loss of identity and meaning. Boundaries are blurred and dissolved. And thus there is a stereotype that the scapegoat is accused of crimes that transgress significant boundaries. These may be violent crimes against those who stand for order and structure, the king or a father. They may be sexual crimes that contravene boundaries, rape, incest, or bestiality, sexual acts that cross cultural taboos and blur crucial distinctions between categories. Possibly they are religious crimes, such as profanation of the host, sitting against the distinction between holy and profane. In every case, the scapegoat is accused of deliberately unleashing chaos upon the community. These moral crimes are considered to be radically virulent, a virus that can spread undifferentiation throughout the community and leave destruction in its wake. Girard states that it is possible that the scapegoat really has committed such a crime, but thinks it more likely that the victim simply belongs to a class that is susceptible to persecution. This stereotype has to do with inherent qualities, usually physical ones. Belonging to an ethnic or religious minority renders the scapegoat not only marginal, but suspect of introducing contamination into the community, the presence of minority being analogously understood as pollution. Since one of the defining qualities of mimetic crisis is that it is contagious because of its mimetic nature, any persons bearing signs of physical contamination or contagion are highly eligible scapegoats. Sickness, madness, genetic deformities, accidental injuries are all signs that are symbolic of contamination, and those possessing them are particularly likely to be seized upon and blamed for the crisis. Girard also notes that when a community habitually chooses its victims from a particular social, ethnic, or religious subgroup, it tends to attribute to them disabilities or deformities that reinforce their status as contaminants. This is observable in long-standing racist stereotypes, their modern expressions in the racist cartoons of the 19th and 20th century and in popular culture today. A final category of eligible victims, perhaps an unexpected one, is that of the exceptionally above average. Girard stipulates that the rich, powerful, and beautiful are also eligible scapegoats because they too are marginal. While in normal times, such persons are protected by their elevated status, in times of crisis, this status makes them marginal with extreme characteristics. Girard notes that sometimes those of elevated status may have deserved violent reprisals, what he calls the holy revolt of the oppressed, but that it can be difficult to later ascertain whether historical justifications came before or after violent uprisings. In any case, his aim is not to determine this, but rather just to list the characteristics which tend to polarize violent crowds into choosing a scapegoat. So then we come to myths. Myths, according to Girard, are the narratives that arise out of scapegoat rituals, telling tales of collective violence against a contaminating intruder. These myths form the oral and written testaments of early religion. Retelling the myths allows the community to experience some cathartic benefit simply through the vicarious emotion of the narrative. And myths also perpetuate the ritual practices they commemorate. The god of the myth demands the repetition of the community cleansing sacrifice. These myths represent acts of persecution in hyperbolic distortions. Every element becomes fantastic. The scapegoats become not only marginal but monstrous, with profound supernatural powers to disorder and destroy, and later to re-establish order and become generative figures, founding fathers, community birthing mothers, and gods. Nevertheless, the distinguishing marks of the scapegoat mechanism may be detected. The description of a crisis involving loss of difference, a scapegoat guilty of crimes associated with undifferentiation, and bearing some stigma of eligibility, such as foreignness or physical deformity, and a collective action against the scapegoat, expelling him or her from the community. Girard argues that myths represent the scapegoat mechanism in an extremely stylized and transfigured fashion. Myths often begin with spectacular undifferentiation. Day and night are confused or not yet instituted. Gods and men mingle. The earth is in drought or flood. This theme of conflict and undifferentiation come together, a battle between enemies who resemble each other closely, perhaps brothers, especially twins. Such conflicts are a graphic representation of the reciprocity of mimetic crisis, what Girard calls the most classic beginning for myths everywhere. Next, the scapegoat enters the narrative bearing the stereotypical marks of persecution. Quote, I need not point out that world mythology swarms with the lame, the blind, and the crippled, or abounds with people stricken by the plague. As well as the heroes in disgrace, there are those who are exceptionally beautiful and free of all blemish. The mythical scapegoat character is often depicted beyond marginality, not only possessing those qualities above, but being monstrous in some way. And Girard notes that mythical monsters are not usually creatures of pure originality, but rather they combine features of existing creatures in unnatural ways. In other words, monsters are a spectacular embodiment of category breakdown. From the Persian shamrosh, which is a dog and bird, the Egyptian amet, which is a lion, hippopotamus, and crocodile, many other examples, hybrid monsters populate the mythical world. Girard's hypothesis regarding mythical monsters not only seeks to explain the ubiquity of monsters in myth, and more particularly the deification of such monsters, but to connect mythical narrative with real events. Whereas the presence of monsters might have been perceived as proof of the absolutely fictitious character of mythology, and therefore dismissed, Girard claims that the theme of monsters points to real ritual sacrifices, the scapegoat mechanism from which the myths arose. The monstrous nature of the mythical victim is not only physical but moral. The scapegoat is accused of crimes of undifferentiation or taboo breaking in the myths, just as they were in the rituals. Bestiality, for instance, not only crosses taboos but joins man to animal in monstrous fashion. In the hyperbole of myth, the stereotypes merge and exaggerate so that physical and moral monstrosity are conflated. The rape committer is a half-animal monster. The physically deformed man is a father murderer. In this way, physical and moral monstrosity are heaped together in myths to justify the persecution of the infirm. In myth, the guilty victim is indistinguishable from his crimes. His offense is an ontological attribute of his monstrous nature. He corrupts by his simple existence. To quote again, in many myths, the wretched person's presence is enough to contaminate everything around him, infecting men and beasts with the plague, ruining crops, poisoning food, causing game to disappear and sowing discord around him. Everything shrivels under his feet and the grass does not grow again. He produces disasters as easily as a fig tree produces figs. He need only be himself. Girard argues that such conflation is the daily fare of mythology, revealing the stereotypes of persecution in innumerable myths, depicting the victim as a monster and therefore deserving of collective violence and expulsion. Of course, one can hardly think of mythical monsters without calling to mind the host of spectacular creatures in Greek mythology. Girard notes that the Greek mythological canon is a list par excellence of scapegoat tropes. It is worth quoting at length his roll call of the marginal and monstrous heroes of Greek myth. The heroes are distinguished by their strength and beauty, but also by monstrous characteristics, gigantic stature, or stature much shorter than the average, or they are combinations of humans and animals, like Laceon the wolf, or able to change themselves into animals. They are androgynous, or change their sex, or dress like women, such as Tiresias or Heracles. In addition, the heroes are characterized by numerous anomalies, such as Heracles has 3 rows of teeth. They're apt to be lame, one-eyed, or blind. Heroes often fall victim to insanity. Their sexual behavior is excessive or aberrant. Heracles impregnates the 50 daughters of Thespius in one night. Theseus is famous for his numerous rapes. The heroes commit incest with their daughters or their mothers and indulge in massacres from envy or anger, or often for no reason at all. So we have this evolution of ancient myth into the Greek myths with the same themes. And then scholars have noted the evolution from Greek mythology to the theatrical tragedies of Greek theatre. And Girard likewise sees Greek tragedy continuing the function of ritual, festival, and myth in a new medium. For Girard, the function is the performance of the scapegoat mechanism. And as Greek society becomes more civilized, especially in moving away from human sacrifice, tragedy takes over the role of ritual in the spectacular performance of the scapegoat sacrifice. To quote, "Once upon a time, there was a temple and an altar on which the victim was sacrificed. Now there is an amphitheater and a stage on which the fate of the katharma played out by an actor will provoke a new catharsis, which will restore the health and well-being of the community." Girard uses the term catharsis deliberately and supports his argument by noting Aristotle's belief that catharsis provision was the function of tragedy. He claims that in describing tragic catharsis, Aristotle was asserting that tragedy can and should assume at least some of the functions assigned to ritual in a world where ritual has almost disappeared. In fact, Aristotle's remarks about the tragic hero fit rather well with Girard's qualifications for the scapegoat. The plot of a tragedy often follows the sequence of the scapegoat myth. A previously stable community is struck by a sudden and terrible crisis. The tragic hero is revealed to be the cause of the crisis, responsible for the intrusion of evil to the community. The hero suffers terribly, is consequently killed or exiled, and peace is restored. The story of Oedipus follows this pattern. The city of Thebes is disrupted by Oedipus's acts. He gouges out his own eyes and flees the city in order to save it. A plague is ravaging Thebes, symbolic of contagion and undifferentiation, and the cause of the plague is found to be one who's committed crimes against difference and order. Oedipus has murdered his father and married his mother. Oedipus himself bears so many of the signs of the scapegoat as to be excessive. He has a limp, he is a stranger, a foreigner, and a king. Girard attended to the Oedipus story at length in Violence and the Sacred and the Scapegoat. Sophocles' tragic retelling of the Oedipus myth is particularly useful to Girardian theory because it exemplifies not only the stereotypes of persecution, but also the progress in the direction of mythical dismantling that Girard finds in some Greek tragedies. This progress is a suspicion of the sacrificial mechanism behind the expulsion of the victim. In Sophocles' case, this is the presence in his text of two things. First, so many explicit stereotypes of persecution, potentially suggesting that Oedipus is a convenient scapegoat rather than truly guilty. And secondly, the assertion in the play itself that Oedipus' father was killed by a group and not by an individual. Girard reads Sophocles as strewing his text with suggestions that Oedipus's guilt is in question. Girard believes that Sophocles' suspicion of myth goes quite far, but cannot be fully expressed within the constraints of the original Oedipus myth, which Sophocles may not modify. His culture forbids him to reveal the principle of the scapegoat, and thus his subversion has its limits. Whilst his tragedies contain their own inner conflicts, the authority of myth is shaken but not toppled. The next aspect of Girard's theory is his examination of the texts of an alternative culture not subject to those restrictions placed upon Sophocles, the narratives in the Judeo-Christian Bible. Girard's preeminent example of a contrasted close reading of Greek versus Jewish myth is his comparison of the Greek Oedipus to the Old Testament story of Joseph. In both narratives, a crisis in a family precipitates the expulsion of a son while he is still a child. In Oedipus, it is the prophecy, in Joseph, the jealousy of his brothers. The two young men become foreigners in a new place, Thebes or Egypt. Oedipus is accused of incest with Jocasta. Joseph is accused of the rape of the wife of Potiphar, his father figure. Oedipus escapes the Sphinx by solving her enigma. Joseph deciphers dream puzzles for Pharaoh. Both Thebes and Egypt experience environmental crises, plague and famine. So much for the similarities, but the difference between the two narratives for Girard is crucial. Oedipus is portrayed as guilty and Joseph as innocent. In the Oedipus myth, the hero is represented as truly guilty of incest and murder, and the plague as the genuine result of his awful crimes. Joseph is innocent of the rape of Potiphar's wife, and far from being responsible for the famine, is the administrator of Egypt's survival. For Girard, this is the impassable gulf between classical myths and biblical myths. In the former, the victim is always guilty, and his persecutors are always justified. On the question of whether the hero deserves to be expelled, the myths answer yes, and the biblical texts, no. This does not imply a difference in the ostensible truth of one versus the other. Like Girard, I assume that what matters about both categories of texts is not their literal fidelity to historical facts, but whether their allegiance is with the persecutor or the victim. This does not preclude the biblical texts from using fictional or mythical techniques, whilst remaining transparent about the innocence of the scapegoat. Similarly, the Psalms take the side of the victims against their persecutors. In their litanies of grievance seeking comfort or vindication, the Psalms allow those who had otherwise become silent victims in the world of myth to voice their complaint against the persecutory mob. The speakers in the Psalms curse their persecutors loud and long, in what Girard claims may be the oldest texts in the world to let the voice of the victims be heard. The book of Job is likewise a super psalm in which the mob accuses Job, and he not only defends himself, but wrests the deity away from the imagination of the mob to envision the deity as the god of victims, not of persecutors. If this Jewish narrative tradition of anti-myths wasn't enough, along comes someone whose actions will be a potent illustration of the perversity of the scapegoat mechanism. Jesus of Nazareth is executed by a malicious populace, and the subsequent narratives recording this violent lynching become the core texts of a new religious culture, Christianity. Conventional myths are what Girard calls texts of persecution, in which the story is told from the persecutor's point of view. And the scapegoat effect, that catharsis, works because the scapegoat is truly perceived as guilty, and his death as a real purging of evil from amongst the community. By contrast, the Judeo-Christian biblical narratives absolve the victim and blame the persecutors, taking the perspective of the victim and revealing that the scapegoat mechanism is the action of a community that happens to be disturbed and is looking for scapegoat relief. Girard carefully stipulates that the tendency of biblical narratives to favor the victims does not mean that the anti-victim stance of myth and the pro-victim stance of the Bible are equivalent prejudices. And the reason he gives for this is simply that those narratives which exonerate the victim are right. Victims seized upon by communities in crisis are not responsible for the crisis, but rather they are just efficacious loci for absorbing the escalating violence. This insight goes beyond ethnocentrism to an awareness of the mechanism at the core of human culture. This is not to say that Jewish experience played no part in this discernment. As Girard says, the Jewish people tossed from expulsion to expulsion are certainly well placed to put the myths in question and to detect in them more quickly than many other peoples the scapegoat phenomena of which they are often the victims. They demonstrate exceptional discernment in the matter of persecutory crowds and their tendency to close ranks against foreigners, those who are isolated, the crippled, the disabled of all sorts. This advantage, gained at a high price throughout history, does nothing to diminish the universality of this truth. It is important to note that Girard does not claim that Judeo-Christian scripture has a monopoly on anti-sacrificial insight. He devoted an entire book to discussion of the anti-sacrificial in the Brahmanas of Vedic India. But rather, the point is that Judeo-Christian scripture is the major influence on Western culture. Girard also notes that Western texts declaring the innocence of the victim exist before and outside Judeo-Christian scripture. He later returned to Sophocles and declared that Antigone achieves what Oedipus does not and subverts the sacrificial narrative. But he argues that those works are isolated examples of writers working across the grain of their dominant culture, as opposed to the predominance of anti-mythical narrative in Jewish culture. This culture evolved and branched into early Christianity and became the dominant culture of Western civilization. It's also worth noting that Girard describes institutional Christianity throughout history as a tyrannical oppressor and persecutor, blind to the perversity of violence despite the defense of the victims in its narrative. And so what we have is a modern Western society that is the result of a complex interaction between the insight of biblical narratives and the sacrificial impulses of communities in crisis. The influence of the scriptural narratives on the modern Western imagination is a force of disruption to the scapegoat mechanism. A community torn apart by collective desire can only use the scapegoat mechanism to recohere so far as they can believe in the guilt of their victim. And victim texts undermine such belief. We have gradually and increasingly become aware that not only Jesus of Nazareth and Antigone, but all analogous victims are innocent. This awareness means that we can no longer have really effective scapegoat rituals or myths, which has made true scapegoat catharsis impossible. Without really believing in the power of the scapegoat, we are stuck. We continue to persecute and victimize, but can no longer truly believe in the guilt of our victims. We make scapegoats, but don't turn them into gods. In Girard's words, we haven't given up having scapegoats, but our belief in them is 90% spoiled. He says victimage is still present among us, of course, but in degenerate forms that do not produce the mythical reconciliation exemplified by primitive cults. This lack of efficiency often means that there are more rather than fewer victims. As in the case of drugs, consumers of sacrifice tend to increase the doses when the effect becomes more difficult to achieve. Blaming and expelling some members of the community is briefly, imperfectly cathartic, and before the catharsis can be called into question, we perform another sacrifice. Girard sees this idea in the apocalyptic vision of Christian scripture, the apocalypse being human violence, retaliating back and forth, always escalating until the whole world is a war zone. Girard argues against the common notion of apocalypse as God's violence against humanity, describing this view as mythological rather than consistent with Judeo-Christian scripture, held by those who do not see that human retaliatory violence is entirely sufficient to bring about the destruction of humanity. Thus, Girard says that Christianity is the only religion that has foreseen its own failure. Judeo-Christian scripture, according to Girard, describes a possible apocalyptic future in which humanity, rather than renouncing retaliation, instead chooses escalating violence. Some Girardian scholars say that the apocalypse began at Verdun. The 20th century certainly saw global violence on an unprecedented scale, wars provoking more wars. Mimetic rivalry and conflict has everyone pushing and shoving for domination. Political violence takes many forms: the Western exploitation of the developing world, the increasing gap between rich and poor, domestic and international terrorism, societies fracturing as communities turn on their neighbours in increasingly violent ways. Ironically, a lot of this violence is still done in the name of Christ. Girard thinks that turning Christianity into a reason for violence is stupid yet predictable. Humans would rather keep scapegoating than give up the benefits of being the persecutor. Girard said that the September 11th attacks in the USA caused a flash of awareness that we are on a path of escalating violence worldwide that could lead to apocalypse. However, in his words, a blanket of silence quickly covered up this insight, and we went back to using violence and persecution to achieve our selfish goals. So what next? The future might look bleak. Humanity, driven by mimetic desire and rivalry, aware that scapegoating is perverse, but in denial, turning on more and more victims to try and get relief, returning violence for violence. But there is hope that we might realize what we're doing before it's too late, and Girardian theory may give us the clues to find that path. As Matthew Taylor put it in his recent article on Rebecca Adams' work, though René Girard's mimetic theory focuses on rivalry, conflict, and scapegoating, there has long been an interest in positive mimesis. Girard's comments on good mimesis were scattered, however, making it difficult for Girardian scholars to define it concretely. It has thus fallen to this generation of scholars to build upon Girard's foundations, to build a model of mimesis that gives us hope for humanity. In these conceptual extensions, Girardian theory points to a way for humanity to be self-giving rather than scapegoating. I considered listing some of these scholars and their work, but I didn't want to miss anybody out. Please pursue resources to find reading lists in your field about these extensions that are currently being done. So what next? I look forward to having that conversation with you all over the remainder of this conference and as we continue our work in Girardian theory and its application. Thank you.
It's very strange. We have to clap by putting up this little this little icon.
Yes.
There's not many questions that I'm seeing, but I think, you know, if you say you're willing to answer questions, I'm guessing that people will begin to chat and I can relate them. Here's a question from Nikolai. Nikolai has a comment. Thank you, highly impressive, hugely impressive.
Thank you very much. I see there, Matthew, you're asking me for permission to use the cartoons. Yes, please, you can get in touch with me on the our little conference socio connections, if you like, or send me an email and I'm happy to share that with you.
Yeah. I do want to mention that I didn't mention the title of the book that Martha reviewed, Tragic Novels, The American Dream, and René Girard, Sacrifice in Suburbia, which I think is a fantastic subtitle, by the way.
Thank you very much. Thank
it's just
you.
coming out. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I look forward to that discussion of my book because due to COVID, I couldn't have a book launch here last year when it came out. And being about the American dream, I really look forward to some conversation with those of you who are based in the US as well. And the other thing that I should mention is that if anybody wants a much more condensed and accessible version of the talk that I just gave, which is sort of the 10-minute version rather than the 1-hour version. I meant to grab this before, I'll just grab it off my bookshelf. You can get this book online, and it's full of those little comic illustrations that I used, and gives Girardian theory in sort of comic book form, very short. So,
Carly, Chris Alan Carter writes the following: Girard describes his scapegoat mechanism so powerfully, and your summary is so effective, a reader or listener could be led to despair. The process tends to escalate. It's difficult to oppose it. It happens faster and faster. Its answer to violence is more violence. How are we to prevent the next round of scapegoating? Chris asks. Is it enough to reveal the workings of the mechanism? What acts, what mass protests, what small resistances offer the best hope?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. So one answer is that I will point you to Rebecca Adams' session tomorrow night, which she's also mentioned in the chat. There is now a scholarly group about positive mimesis and loving mimesis. The idea that mimesis itself is not inherently bad. That's just who we are. Human beings are imitative. I have a small child. Imitation is how we become who we are. We imitate those around us for good or for bad. The idea of positive mimesis is that we may take models who we do not become rivalrous with. And for me personally, I'm very influenced by the work of the great Girardian theologian James Allison, who talks about the idea that the imitation of Christ is a form of mimesis that does not lead to rivalry, because what we are imitating, rather than being sort of acquisitive and selfish, is imitating self-sacrifice and self-giving. And so the idea is that if humanity finds a model of humanity which is self-giving rather than rivalrous, that can spread by mimesis and lead us to better things. That's my 30-second answer, but there are many scholars in this field who've done beautiful work on it. James Allison is one of my favorites, but certainly I encourage you to attend the session tomorrow on positive mimesis, because that is the big question after the kind of, quite scary implications of negative mimesis. Where do we turn to find hope?
Looking to see if there are more questions that come up. Nikolai Blaskow makes a reference to Fred All's book. Fred All's book was actually written in context of my dissertation. I handed it to him, and he then handed it to his class, and he said, they said, well, where did you find this idea? And he said, well, I found it from my class. Well, because I had given it to him, and he gave it to his class. That was a very strange, that's a long history that Nick,
wonderful.
Wouldn't know about. Yeah.
I'm just going to put my email address in the chat here. For those who would like to.
All right, here's a question that Tim Seitz writes. How might the mimetic crisis describe the current USA political context?
Wow, well, that is a big question.
Exactly. Yeah.
Read my book.
Yeah. Yeah.
Look, one of the things that I go into in my book in quite a lot of detail is that my take on the American dream is that it is by its nature a catalyst for mimetic crisis, because it is about ascending, but it is also about everybody having an equal opportunity to ascend, which sounds nice, and if we could actually work it out in real ways would be lovely. But in practice, what it does is it creates stratifications of rivalry where certain groups are trying to keep other groups from opportunity. And so as long as you have a culture built around an ideal of success, which is about being more successful than other people, that is a catalyst for mimetic crisis. And you get all of these kinds of things around intense rivalry based on those stereotypes of persecution. And you get a lot of conflict and both rhetorical and real violence around who gets to climb the ladder and who doesn't, and under what circumstances, and quite vicious acts by those at the top of the ladder, which are intended to hold on to those objects of desire, of power and privilege. So that's my short answer. I think in order for the US political context to shift some of those cultural ideas about what it means to be successful or even to be American are going to need to be re-examined. I'm reluctant to be too critical because I'm sitting on the outside looking in as somebody who has never lived in America, although I visited and experienced some lovely hospitality from you wonderful people. But from a long historical perspective, what I do in my book is I kind of look at the ideals upon which America was founded and how they play out in who feels entitled to the promise of the American dream and who feels that others are not entitled to the promise of the American dream. So yes, please do come to my book session. I'm really, really excited to have this conversation at length. I'm not going to give a lecture in that session. The whole session is going to be open conversation. So we can really talk. And
I actually have a question. I don't know if you want to take this up, which is related to what you just said, which is in Australia, is there a kind of discussion of Native Australians as there is to some extent in the United States of Native Americans? I know it was beginning when I was there. I got senses of the beginnings of it, but
yeah, I mean, like all colonial countries, we are really wrestling with the persecutions and the oppressions that not only happened in the past, but continue to perpetuate an enormous amount of injustice today. So I think, sort of all Western colonial countries have both movements to address those injustices and also those who want to minimize those injustices or even continue to perpetuate them. I would say that the big difference between Australian culture and American culture is that the founding myths, if you like, of Australia, of the convicts who settled Australia, of our early ideals about what it means to be Australian are a lot less glamorous, to be honest. The underdog is the Australian hero. And so it's kind of this idea of fight the man and you know, we don't want to be at the top of the heap. We kind of, I mean, materialistically, yes, we do, because we're a Western nation, but some of those ideals are about valorizing the underdog and the everyman. Mm-hmm. which I think is a little different from American culture, where the American hero is actually strong and handsome and rich and, kind of Captain America. The Australian hero is Crocodile Dundee. He's kind he's scruffy, and he has, his own sort of marks of status in that value system, but that rivalry towards a certain kind of being the king of the hill has not been as evident in Australian culture. Having said that, of course, as a Western materialistic culture, there are enormous amounts of wealth and privilege and injustice here as everywhere.
Felicity McCallum points out that she's going to address this kind of issue as well, vis-a-vis Girardian thought, in the Loving Mimesis research group's plenary that is going to take place tomorrow.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you, Nikolai, for pointing out that it is NIDOC Week, which is our week where our First Nations people call for reconciliation and draw attention to the injustices that have been done to them, past and present. And I'll actually be attending some really great NIDOC sessions this week, but unfortunately they will all be in the middle of the night for you guys, so I can't invite you. If you do want to come to a NIDOC session at 2 a.m. your time, send me an email and I'll send you a link.
I'm looking to see if there are any questions that have come in that I have not addressed for you. Tim Seitz says, respect to Australia for having such a week.
Yeah, it's lovely. Yeah. Oh, I see here Felicity has a comment about the scapegoat mechanism being more virulent in archaic society.
Okay.
So it's not so much that it's more virulent in those societies, Felicity, as that it's more explicit. So in those ancient societies, it's literally, we build an altar and at every full moon, we pick some marginal scapegoat and sacrifice them to the gods who are themselves former scapegoats. And so it's very explicit. That becomes further ritualized and then begins to transition into myth as societies move away from doing human sacrifice. There's often a transitional stage of animal sacrifice. And then as you move towards myth taking the place of ritual, because it becomes hyperbole and then into Greek tragedy, it's hidden in a way that it wasn't when it was explicit human sacrifice. This is not to say that it doesn't still happen. And in fact, we can look around the 21st century and see it happening, but we don't stylize it in the way that those societies did. And so it is more difficult to identify. Yes, and Julie, yes, it is the case that scapegoating is not a conscious thing, because when we use the word scapegoating, what we mean is the lynching of an innocent person.
Right.
So if you are aware that you are performing a lynching, you are no longer getting the catharsis of the scapegoat mechanism.
Right.
A satisfactory scapegoat sacrifice is one in which the persecutors truly believe in the guilt of their victim.
Right.
But for Girard, the idea is that in the modern Western imagination, as hard as we try to believe that, there's always going to be this little voice in the back of our heads saying, doesn't this look a lot like Joseph and his brothers? Doesn't this look a lot like, the various stories and sense that we have from Judeo-Christian narratives about the mob turning upon the innocent victim? And so if you take an example of, 19th century lynchings of Black Americans, there might have been a white mob who were 99.9% convinced that that Black person was a genuine pollutant in their community, and the right thing to do was to eliminate that pollutant. But for every person in that crowd, Girard suggests they cannot get away from that little bit of unconscious knowledge that it's a lynching, and that this is what Western society is, that tension and that push and pull and that struggle between wanting to believe in the guilt of the scapegoat because it serves a function for us, and knowing deep down that the scapegoat is innocent. And so we're all doing this all the time. You know, like, yeah, as the comments are sort of saying, that the scapegoating goes underground.
Right.
Use social media, blah blah blah. But it's a direct ratio. It works better the more you believe in the guilt of your victim.
Yeah.
And so if you start to doubt the guilt of your victim, what Girard says is actually you've got two choices. You can admit that you were wrong, or you can double down and victimize them even harder to try and drown out that little voice in your head telling you that they're innocent. And that's what Girard sees in, you know, modern scapegoating and social media and all those kinds of spaces, is that some of us at some times try to turn towards that truth and that insight about the innocence of the victim. And at other moments, humans refuse to acknowledge that insight and instead increase their violence and their victimization to keep on getting that cathartic effect.
Julie Shinnick asks if there's a difference between sacrifice and scapegoating, or how sacrifice and scapegoating differ in their description.
Broadly, they're not really. They are both actions intended to cleanse the community of a pollutant. To get into the nature of the way that sacrifice changes throughout the Old Testament is both beyond my time limits and my expertise, because what you begin to have in the Old Testament is an awareness in the Israelites that it is actually their sin which is being put upon the goat.
Right.
So that's kind of, there's some complexities there. But effectively, sacrifice in Girardian terms is just another word for, as a community, we are in crisis. We need to identify whose fault it is and then kill them.
Julie points out that sometimes sacrifice doesn't always bring out the victimage thematically, that different behaviors and ritual behaviors can have originated with victimization, but they don't necessarily retain that appearance.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I mean, Girard talks about scapegoating as a spontaneous thing, but he continues to use that language about formal sacrifice as well. It's so, yeah, the distinction that you make is useful, but if you're reading Girard, he doesn't always use the language that way. And the victim in sacrifice may not be accused of crimes particularly, but they do deserve to die. You cannot have an effective sacrifice if everybody knows that the person being sacrificed does not deserve to die. Otherwise, it's perverse.
Nikolai wants us to talk. Nikolai Blaskow wants us to talk about Iphigenia as a prime example of a different reason for sacrifice. Sacrifice of women, you know, and going to war.
So this is this idea of the gods demanding sacrifice.
Yeah.
And so again, the victim deserves to die because the gods demand it. And so it's not perverse. It's the same kind of thing of, in order for the gods who demand sacrifice to smile upon us, we must give sacrifices.
Right.
So it's, yeah, I mean, there's lots and lots of different forms of sacrifice, lots and lots of different reasons, but it's, yeah, guaranteeing success or whatever it is, but it's the crucial thing is that the victim deserves to die, that the mob are in the right, and that the sacrifice is the right thing to do, as opposed to the insight from the story of Joseph or the crucifixion of Christ, where the mob is in the wrong.
Right.
So this is the difference, that in the case of scapegoating or sacrifice, whichever word you use, the mob is right.
In fact, yeah, right. They don't see themselves as a mob. They see it as a necessity. Right?
Absolutely, and they may even see themselves as a highly rational and structured society who are doing the absolutely moral thing by making the sacrifice.
Right. This is reality. This is what needs to be done.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you can think about very salient modern political examples. My country is particularly cruel to asylum seekers. When people arrive here by boat seeking asylum, we put them in concentration camps in remote islands off the shore of Australia, where they suffer terribly. And unfortunately, the majority of Australian voters believe that this is just what has to be done.
What has to be done, yeah.
Yeah.
How could you do it any other way?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I just see John has asked for my contact info. I did put my email address further up in the chat. I'll put it again now. And you can contact me anytime through the conference website, where you can make contacts and chat to one another and so forth. I'll be active on the conference website for the remainder of the week.
Great. Any other questions that any of you would like to ask at this point of Carly? She's been so generous with her explanation. Here's one more comment or questions come on. Oh, there it is. It's Carly's Osborn at Divinity. Yeah. Divinity.
Yep. See Osborn at divinity.edu.au.
Thank you, Carly. This is wonderful. This is fantastic, and it completes the first day in a wonderful fashion. And I hope it's not too early for you to have gotten up.
No, it's fine. It's I'm almost exactly opposite you, so you just kind of swap AM PM, and that's what it is for me. And just before we formally close, I'd just like to mention that I put a note on the social wall on the website. If anybody would like to have dinner for you guys, which is breakfast for me, what will be tomorrow night for you, please let me know on the social wall. And I thought I might make a Zoom space, and we can all kind of bring our own and have a glass of wine and have dinner together, as we would usually do at a conference. So please let me know on the social wall if you would like to come to dinner.
What a great idea. What a great idea. I hope people take you up on it. I have a feeling they will.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Carly. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so very much.
We can put our little cartoons up now and applaud Carly.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Nathan, Sandy, do you need me to stay on the Zoom after we close?
No, I think we're fine. I'm just seeing is anyone else. There's applause. Thank you. And then okay, I guess we're all set here. And we can all do what we would like to do at this point.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you. So nice to see you, Sandy. And I look
too,
forward
you
to
too,
seeing
Carly.
you again throughout the conference.
Virtually will.